Well, thank you. It's nice to be on the main campus. So I'm a faculty in the biology department, and I'm also a marine scientist at the Sea Lab. University of Alabama historically has had at least one person at the Sea Lab, a faculty at the Sea Lab. So, I get to spend a lot of time on the coast, and then, generally I do come up on the main campus for faculty meetings and such, in the department. So, by training, I'm really a biogeochemist, and my interest has been mostly looking at nutrient budgets and looking at nitrogen cycling. And the reason is that nitrogen is generally thought of as a limiting nutrient in the ocean, and so dynamics, processes that affect nitrogen cycling tend to have large impacts on coastal processes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And so most of the work that's going to be talked about is people in my lab that do it. I just get to kind of put it together, and I'm grateful for the help I've had over the years from technicians, lab managers, postdocs, and current students in the lab. And then, we've been working for quite a bit with Patty. She's been looking at the salt marsh boiling for quite a while, long-term data sets, and then in a project that was funded through the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative called ACER, and that's a consortium that's led out of the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and it has faculty from universities all the way to University of South Florida and Rutgers and Boston, and so it's a big group of people for a project that is ending actually in a few months, and it was close to $7 million. So for those of you who might not be familiar with the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, we are just located right here. And the bay is obviously quite important economically for the state, but it's also a very interesting ecosystem because it's quite large and it has one of the largest rivers. Past Mississippi is the largest river, dumping a lot of nutrients and sediments into the bay. It's 50 kilometers long and as wide as 39 kilometers, but it's a very shallow ecosystem, so it's easily resuspended by winds and tides, and that's one of its characteristics, I would say. On average, it's about 3 meters deep, and there are a couple of big rivers coming in and dumping fresh water into the delta. The Tombigbee and the Alabama River that form the confluence of those two is the Mobile River, and the watershed, obviously it's a huge watershed, 110,000 kilometers, and it spans over several states, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and so forth. So the Sea Lab has been there, but maybe folks up here on the main campus don't know much about it, but really UA has had a presence on the coast for over 50 years now. It was in the late 60s that faculty from the biology department and students started coming down to the coast and visiting a lab that was run. It was the Seafood Division, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. That lab was operated by them, and then UA got interested. And in 1963, Alabama actually led the effort to build a lab on Dauphin Island. So UA has been, really behind the Sea Lab for quite a while, since at least the 60s, and we've had a continuous presence of UA faculty at the Sea Lab. And then the Sea Lab was transformed in the 1970s by the Alabama State legislator and became what is known as the Marine Environmental Sciences Consortium. And the way the Sea Lab is set up is that it's supposed to serve the whole of the state. So faculty from different universities are welcome to come and use the resources of the Sea Lab and have faculty actually present on the grounds the whole time. So besides Auburn, University of South Alabama, I'm currently the other faculty, but there's about 22 members that form the consortium from all over the state, private and state-funded schools that are down at the Sea Lab. Currently, the Sea Lab is about 35-acre campus, and We do quite a bit of education and outreach, and we have a big component of undergraduate teaching from students all over the state that come there. About 40 graduate students are registered at the C-Lab. They're present permanently at the C-Lab. And you can see that, you know, we generate about 1,600 credit hours during a single year. So it's a pretty large presence. And they have also a big undergraduate and a big K through 12 and a big public outreach component to them. And they have what they call an estuarium. It's really an aquarium that is set up to mimic the whole of Mobile Bay, starting from the delta all the way to the offshore ecosystems. And they get about 80,000 people coming and visiting the estuarium every year. So they've had a large impact in terms of education and outreach, and a lot of goodwill from the legislators, because more than likely they either have gone through the C-Lab themselves or have a grandchild that is currently at the C-Lab doing something education outreach component. So they've played that up pretty well, I think, and they've been serving admission throughout these years. So besides, you know, small vessels, they also have larger vessels, a 45, 46 foot and a 65 foot that allows them to do offshore work and stay out overnight. These are large vessels. And, you know, the nice thing about it is that they maintain and operate them. We as users just pay a user day fee, you know, a few $100s to a couple of $1,000s depending on the need. And we don't really, University of Alabama doesn't have to maintain the infrastructure. The state does that for us. And to encourage our faculty at University of Alabama to really get to know the C-Lab and to come down there, we initiated a few years ago a program with Dean Olin and the C-Lab, where there's some seed money for faculty to come and stay at the C-Lab. So there's nice housing, and faculty can come and stay for 2-3 weeks time period. The C-Lab provides housing and facilities, and Dean Olin, I think, provides some incentive for faculty to really come and see it for themselves and do research at the C-Lab. So we've had people from geology and biology and elsewhere that come in the summer and spend some time with us at the C-Lab and use the facility. And if you're interested in that aspect of it, I'd be happy to tell you more about it. So in terms of my own research, you know, there are two really dominant forces that I think about when I'm thinking about coastal processes from a biogeochemist perspective. And one is, you know, the population growth that we're having along the coastline, as well as this issue of sea level rise. And being trained as a biogeochemist, you know, I have to think about, you know, how are these two forces affecting something as complicated as the nitrogen cycle. So this is a depiction of the nitrogen cycle, and I'll go through it a little bit in more detail. But really, those are the two drivers that I think about, you know, in terms of population growth, sea level rise, and impact on marine ecosystems, and more specifically, from my point of view, how is nitrogen cycling being affected by these two drivers? And I'll be, hopefully the rest of the talk, be able to convince you of how these two drivers are having an impact on the coastline, but it's being mediated by the nitrogen cycle, things I'm going to talk about. So sea level rise, you know, we're familiar with it, you know, and it is no doubt that it's been happening, and it's just been getting worse, you know, and that those are IPCC projections, and we think that IPCC is actually underestimating the actual sea level rise, but they're being very, very conservative in their estimates because they don't want to get caught afterwards for being wrong. But, you know, actual sea level rise is faster, you know, it's around 3 millimeters a year. That's what IPCC projects, you know, and that's global. But, you know, there's evidence that actually it's a lot faster than what IPCC is projecting as a mean. And obviously the impact of that is that, you know, we have a lot of, you know, population that lives right along the coastline, and, you know, has some impacts on our infrastructure and as well as our ecosystems. So people want to live on the coast, and there's nothing to stop them from doing that, as long as we are providing these flood insurance events and so forth. You know, people want to be at the coast. It's a beautiful place to live. And if you look at population growth over the years, you know, there is about less than 10% of our area of the United States is really coastal areas, but 39% of the population growth happens there. So that's a big discrepancy in terms of, the area that this coastal communities represent. And if you think about it, everybody is moving to Florida, or people are moving to Gulf shores, and we get this disproportionate growth happening on the coastline. So with that, comes some sort of effect. All right, so thinking about those two, this issue of population growth and sea level rise, can we, what are the impacts that we have seen in the recent past, let's say the past couple of 100 years and maybe the past 50 years along the Alabama coastline, and can we really try to project or understand how these changes that are very apparent and obvious, could we account for these processes and see the impact of these changes that have happened along the coastline to the health of the ecosystems. So the evidence suggests that over a 200-year period, we've lost 50% of the wetlands along the coastline. And that is a huge number when you think about it. And it's even worse because over the 20-year period, the evidence suggests that 30% of the non-freshwater marshes have been lost along the coastline. So these are dramatic impacts when you think about it in terms of how the coastline is changing. And when we think about this, is the culprits are generally development, subsidence, and some succession of these ecosystems. And we think that population growth and sea level is going to have an impact on at least the immediate coastline, which is where these salt marshes are located. The salt marshes are interesting environments because they're very productive, right? And they, the way people in literature or in newspapers talk about salt marshes is that they're kidneys of the land, right? So all these nutrients that flow, they get intercepted at the salt marsh before they reach the ocean. So disappearance of the salt marsh could potentially have an impact on the delivery of material from upland ecosystems into our coastal areas. And the question for us has been, well, by how much, right? How valuable are these ecosystems, and how has their disappearance potentially affected the coastlines? So when we think about impacts on the coastline, it's not uncommon to see images like this, showing fish kills. So here's, Fox 10 News in 2015, and there's just, these are recurrent patterns that happen along the coastline. They could be, fish kills that are not really totally well understood maybe, but the culprits of it are generally things I'm going to talk about. But this is something that happens, and this is different than a jubilee that we might get. This is just like suddenly the wildlife as the fish are dying, and can have impacts on the seabirds and so forth. So this is the image that we have to deal with, and in my lab and people I collaborate with, we try to understand, before we get to this, how did this material flow from, let's say, land and got into the ocean, and I'll talk about the mechanisms behind this that lead to things like this and then cause these detrimental effects, right? Nobody wants to live at a coastline that has a bunch of dead fish flowing in it, right? But yet we want to move to the coastline. So my colleagues at the Sea Labs, at the Sea Lab had been looking at, instances of harmful algal blooms. So harmful algal blooms, as the name suggests, is algae that blooms during specific times of the year or conditions. And the reason they're harmful is that they generally have some sort of neurotoxin maybe associated with them that are detrimental either to us human beings, so you might go on the beach and develop asthma as a result of those toxins that might be in the air, or they might cause some sort of fish kills, so they impact the gill for a lot of fish, and then maybe we do get all those fish kills. So when people have monitored, so this is all along the Alabama coastline, and all of those dots are indicating instances where harmful algae have bloomed. And my colleague McIntyre was in the business of trying to understand, well, what is it that's causing these blooms? And that's a altogether interesting story. I don't have much time to go into that, but you can see that, along the coastline, this is just our coastline that was being monitored over years. These harmful algae have been blooming. And when they do a seasonal study or follow these throughout the year, so this is from 2004 to 2008, and each one of these dots represent the density of these blooms, it indicates that, no matter what location they went to and they monitor, with the exception of very few instances, there are algae, harmful algae that are present in the water, and they can bloom, right? And these blooms were generally thought to result from, his analysis showed that these blooms result from groundwater input that is super rich in nutrients, and that nutrient comes in, causes the algae to grow to disproportionate number, and it has an effect on the ecosystem. So this is what the coastline looks like in terms of its one aspect of its health, is that we have multiple locations throughout the years, and over the years we do have these algae that bloom, and the evidence suggests that it's related to how much nutrient is coming in, but at a lot of these locations it's not direct river input, it's maybe groundwater input. Why would we care, right? So the other interesting aspect of this work was that they were able to show that this domoic acid, this toxin that was in this harmful algae that blooms along our coastline, it was related, its concentration was related to some metric of nutrients. And here, that is total nitrogen, the ratio of total nitrogen to total phosphorus. So when you gave them a tremendous amount of nitrogen, these algae, not only they bloom, but they also develop, you got more and more concentration of this toxin, domoic acid. And what was interesting is that they were able to show that there was trophic transfer of this domoic acid, meaning that the small larvae and other fish that were consuming in these waters, the fish or the algae, they ended up accumulating this domoic acid in their tissue. And that's how we would get them, right? We're not going to be drinking this water and accumulating domoic acid, but we're going to be consuming seafood that has been in the food web and accumulated this toxin, for example, and then that's how it gets into our diet, right? And so there's concern about, are we maintaining the health of the bay such that these instances are minimized and we don't end up having to shut down the oyster industry or the fisheries because they're being affected by these harmful algae that are blooming, evidence suggesting that it's mostly related to too much nutrients coming in and the circumstances being right so that these things bloom and they take over. So a lot of nutrients, it's not good, right? And one of the things that's interesting, this is a picture of Gulf Shores, is that while most of the population in counties in Alabama have stayed steady or even declined, there are a few counties near Auburn, Huntsville, and Gulf Shores, Baldwin County, that have had a huge, tremendous amount of growth over the years, right? So a lot of people do want to retire at the coast, and this population is increasing, and where are they building? Right on the coastline. Right? They're literally right at the water's edge. And this growth of population comes with, us modifying our environments and trying to make it suitable for our needs. So, for example, a lot of retiree people, they want to play a lot of golf. So Baldwin County has gone from years of planting cotton to, actually used to be a lot of pecans, and they destroyed the orchards, and then cotton, and then some of the cotton orchard now is being replaced by sod farming. And if you know anything about sod farming, is that it takes tremendous amount of nutrients to keep these green and to be able to replace them, grow them fast enough so you can put them on these golf courses that are all over. And they ship this stuff to not only to Baldwin County, but all over the state. But as a result, Jeff Tick, who's a colleague of us, and his student, they were able to look at, the land use in Baldwin County, and mostly being now agriculture, and agriculture has transformed itself into a lot of sod farming and a lot of nurseries, besides just, cotton and orchards for pecans. While using a lot of nutrients those, if you look at groundwater concentration of nitrogen, it's to the limit of EPA standards for human consumption. So groundwater being contaminated, making it into the bay, it starts to make a compelling connection between what we do on land, how we're developing the land, our land use, and impact in the bay in terms of its health and structure. And those harmful algae are one sign of too much nutrients coming in, and sources of it aren't too hard to figure out. You know, where we know that groundwater is super rich, and we also have a lot of wastewater treatment plants that overflow and dump the water into the bay. Besides the storms that we get on Dauphin Island and elsewhere along the coastline, so this is a generic image of a coastline, we're constantly modifying the coastline, especially barrier islands, to suit our needs, you know? And it's just being exacerbated by the sea level rise that's actually a station at Dauphin Island, and it's keeping up with the global average of 3 millimeters. That in Dauphin Island is about 3.5 millimeters a year. So sea level is increasing, and it has an impact, right, on a lot of our ecosystems and the time frame that, you know, we think, well, 3 millimeters a year isn't that much, right? But think about as a PhD student, when they start at a marsh that is right at sea level, right? The edge of the marsh is right at sea level. Over a 5-year PhD student's career of making measurement, that has risen almost by 3/4 of an inch over that time. And so if you have a low-lying land, a marsh, that little bit over a 5-year period, it's enough to actually start inundating the marsh, right? And this is happening all over, and Dauphin Island is faring well compared to, for example, Louisiana, where not only you have sea level rise, but you have to deal with subsidence, and there it's like 3 times the global average. They're having issues as big as 9 millimeters or more per year because the land is sinking because they pumped all the groundwater or oil out of the wells, and the land is sinking, and you have global sea level rise on top of that, so it makes things worse. So sea level, population growth, you know, they're real, they're happening. Now, what are the consequences? Well, as I mentioned, you know, I'm interested in the nitrogen cycle, and you might wonder, well, how am I going to relate all of this to the nitrogen cycle? So the nitrogen cycle, it's a really pesky, complicated elemental cycle. There's a lot of redox states for nitrogen, but I'm going to try to make it as simplistic as possible for the purpose of this talk. And this is a figure out of a paper by Canfield, and you know, you can see that, you know, if we start with nitrate all the way up on the top of the figure, it can pursue 2 pathways. One is aerobic, so in the presence of oxygen, and there's a whole lot of processes that happen anaerobically, right? And all of these red dots are genes that are coding for enzymes that are responsible for transformation of, you know, one redox state to the next, right? So, you know, most of the nitrogen is tied up in the atmosphere as nitrogen gas, but that's biologically unavailable except to a few organisms that are capable of fixing nitrogen. Everybody else operates on this side where nitrate and ammonium are being transformed, and they're trying to pick and choose the redox state that fits them and make use of it. Preferred form is ammonium because before you put it in nitrogen into proteins, you got to take it to ammonium anyway. So if you start with nitrate, you know, you got to take it down all the way down to ammonium. But you know, we don't want to get hung up, and we're not microbiologists, and that's a shame, but you know, we're not microbiologists, so I'm going to simplify this nitrogen cycle to, you know, the evil twins, I call them, the good and the bad. So what is good in the nitrogen cycle and what is bad in the nitrogen cycle? As far as I'm concerned, we have too much nitrogen at the coast, and we want to get rid of this nitrogen. So there's a whole slew of organisms, microbes, that are involved in taking nitrate, and they can actually transform it into N2 gas. And once that happens, nitrogen leaves the system, right? But the evil twin, you know, the bad side, is that it takes nitrate, you know, there's a whole series of organisms involved in what's referred to as dissimilatory nitrogen reduction to ammonium, right? And what they do is they take ammonium, and nitrate, and they take it back into ammonium. And then this ammonium stays in the system and can feed the processes that are dependent on ammonia. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be kind of referring to these two processes, denitrification, and when I'll remember, I'll mention it by the good twin, and then DNRA, this dissimilatory nitrate reduction to ammonium, the evil twin, and I'll refer to it as the bad, right? But ultimately, what this does is that it keeps either nitrogen in the system or it gets rid of nitrogen from the system. And that's what kind of like, have built my whole career around these two processes, basically, right? So it turns out that marshes promote all kind of goodness, but they are eroding away, right? So this is a picture in 1992 of a causeway that I drive to go from Mobile to Sea Lab. And you can see that, the extent of the marsh in 1992 and 2016, it's all gone. And the reason we even have a little bit of it left is because they had to put those structures to help reduce wave action to keep the marsh from eroding away. Right? So what's nice about marshes is that they promote the good process that I'm interested in. They promote denitrification. They promote nitrate removal and turning it into nitrogen gas so it leaves the system. Too much nitrogen, we know it leads to, it's a fertilizer, right? So it leads, if you fertilize too much, you end up with a lot of weeds in your lawn, right? And that's what those harmful algae are in essence, right? So marshes are great at getting rid of this excess nitrogen, but they're eroding away, So the question for us has been, well, what is the mechanism behind marshes eroding away? We know that, a lot of wave action, we know sea level rise, has an impact on marshes. It just promotes, the reason marshes exist is because the vegetation slows down sediments that moving next to it, and those sediments get deposited. When the marsh dies, a new set of vegetation grows on top of it, and you accrete this mass that you build up, and it can keep up with sea level, or sea level can rise too fast and it drowns it. Right? But we also know there's all kinds of anthropogenic issues with marshes disappearing, a lot of development and such that promote the destruction of marshes, unfortunately. But marshes have this central role of allowing nitrogen to be removed from the system. So over the years, we've examined a lot of marshes, most recently with Patty's group and others, we've been working on the Chandeleur Islands, but this is Dauphin Island, and we've examined, marshes all along Mobile Bay and tried to understand, how, in essence, how healthy these marshes are, and trying to understand, what happens to it. And it's nice to work in Mobile Bay because you can be around, sub-watersheds that are of vastly different characteristics. If you work in Weeks Bay, it's mostly forested, right? If you work, for example, in the Dog River system or the Fowl River, they have these different proportions of how heavily they are urbanized and what type of wastewater treatment is ahead of these watersheds. So it gives you like a good metric or a good variability in a variety of parameters that could really be helpful to us to understand. So we really enjoy working, being at the coast and having access to all of these different sub-watersheds. So I'm going to show some data from some of these marshes that we have worked in. And so we picked 3 sites, Dauphin Island, Dog River, Weeks Bay, and some characteristic of these, they have different salinity regimes because they're closer to the seawater edge or they're farther in. And so they differ in terms of their salinity, so from like salty to super fresh, and they have different vegetation, so caladium or spartina, but and below ground, above ground biomass. So we covered a range of variability by picking these 3 stations. But over a year period, so this is one of our sites that's been installed with all kinds of sensors, but we use static chambers. We can go to a marsh and see how much CO2, for example, it's removing from the atmosphere how much CO2 is returning back to the atmosphere, and we can do a carbon balance for a marsh. So when we went to these sites, and I don't want to get too hung up on the figures here, but this is measurements of exchange during at the peak of at noon, at solar noon. So what this shows is that G is gross ecosystem exchange, R is respiration, and the balance between those two determines what remains behind. And if you measure carbon exchange of a marsh at midday, what the data is suggesting here is that yes, it's removing a lot of carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into probably below ground biomass and some above ground biomass, and that actually helps the marsh grow. Right? But the story got really complicated because we know that that's happening at midday, but there's 24 hours in a day, and at nighttime these guys are just respiring, and during the day, depending on how much light is available, they're going to be taking up carbon at a specific rate that is related to light availability, right? So we measured how much carbon they take up by varying the light regime at all of these plots that we were working in, right? So you can shade them to a given irradiance, and then you can measure how that affects carbon uptake. And so we also measured respiration, so we can look at, if it's totally dark at nighttime, when these things are just respiring, what that looks like. And the figure is too small here, but what this is temperature, and that's the rate of respiration. So the higher temperatures, it promotes faster decomposition and more respiration. Putting all of this together, what we were able to show is that all of these ecosystems, they're losing carbon during the year. So it's true that marshes, we think of marshes as sinks for carbon, but when we actually do the budget for long periods, taking into account light availability and respirations and modeling this from over a 24-hour period, and then budgeting this over a whole annual cycle, or at least this is monthly data, what this suggested to us, the data suggested that the marsh is actually losing carbon. Right? So all of these negative numbers for all of these three different marshes suggest that the marsh is actually, in essence, burning up in place. So if the marsh loses more than it's assimilating, it cannot keep up with sea level rise, right? Because that's one of the mechanisms the marsh uses to stay up. If it loses, it just gets compacted and eventually eroded away. Right? So using our respiration rate measurements, we did a simple, just back of the envelope calculation. And because our growing season is so long already, right? Its growing season is not going to really, the assimilation is not going to change by much, but respiration is going to vary, and it's going to increase in response to increases in future temperature rises. So we're able to show that in the future, it's going to get even worse with rising temperatures. They're going to even lose more carbon than they currently are, because respiration is a temperature-driven process. Right? So could it be that these marshes we've lost 50% of our marshes over the past 200 years because of the mechanisms we have identified here? They're just like respiring more than they are assimilating, right? And that is contributing to weakening the marsh. With increases in sea level, then the marsh collapses and erodes away. So that's what we have suggested. But you might say, well, how could they survive? I mean, it's just like me running half a marathon and eating no food. At some point, I'm just going to die off. Like, how is it that we even have marshes if they're losing their mass every day, every year, over extended periods of time? Well, it turns out that the mechanism we think they survive, and people think in the literature, the mechanism that allows these marshes to exist even despite the fact that they're losing so much carbon, is that we get these periodic hurricanes. Every 3 to 5 years, we get hurricanes that bring and dump massive loads of sediment on the marsh, and then it helps the marsh grow up. Right? So that's what adds some height to the marsh. Right? So it's interesting that we think of hurricanes as super destructive, and they are, but it's actually the mechanism. So this is the floodlight as a house on Dauphin Island, right? And you can see that the floodlight, and it's a house that is raised off the ground, it's loaded with sediment, right? So you can imagine, a 9-foot or 10-foot surge that comes in, floods everything and also the marshes, but ends up depositing like chunks of as much as 8 centimeters of sand on Dauphin Island alone. So that probably helps the marsh keep up, right? But it's periodic and it's hard to predict ultimately what will happen to that. So the story I'm telling you right now is that marshes are really good for removing nitrogen, and I'll tell you by how much, but they are disappearing because they're under stress and they're losing more than they're gaining, right? And they survive by these periodic inputs of sediments that bring material to the coast, and it brings them back up. Otherwise, they couldn't keep up with sea level. Right? So they're under stress as it is, and then when you get something like an oil spill happening, the oil spill erodes, kills the vegetation, right? If you have too much of it, it kills the vegetation, and the marsh, suddenly the vegetation is no longer there to hold all that material together, and it erodes away. And people examine, these impacted compared to reference marshes, during the aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon, and this is data from Brian Silliman, and he shows that, in the dark spots, the oil marshes, the edge was eroding a lot faster than a regular non-impacted marsh. So the oil spill, comes in, weakens, kills the vegetation, it's not there, it dies off, it's what held all of that sediment together, it erodes away, and it just gets worse, right? So marshes are super susceptible, and now we add some oil spill on top of it, and that makes things worse, right? So marshes promote this good side of the nitrogen cycle. They really contribute to removing nitrogen that comes in from land that is flowing into the marsh. It traps that nitrogen and transforms it into a gas that goes back to the atmosphere. So in essence, that's why it is the kidney of the land, because it's removing this toxin material that could be toxin, from the coast, right? They not only transform nitrogen, but they transform every other element, heavy metals, phosphorus, and so forth. So can we quantify how effective these marshes are in terms of removing nitrogen? So this is work we did in the Chandeleurs, and I'm just showing a portion of it, a small portion of it. So we examined, the marsh, this process of denitrification, the good side of the nitrogen cycle, the good twin, and on the marsh edge, on the marsh platform, as well as like a meter away from the marsh platform when it has eroded away. And having some measurements, this is a portion of the measurements I'm showing, we come to the conclusion that, a marsh, can remove on average 3.6 tons of nitrogen per kilometer square per year, as opposed to this marsh edge, which is no longer a marsh, but is subtidal unvegetated sediment, it's removing less than a ton. So by a factor of 4 difference, when you have the vegetation, the marsh, as opposed to when it's eroded away. Now think about all of the marsh along Mobile Bay and remove 50% of that, right? So now you can put numbers together to examine, to try to imagine what the impact is of how much material now is making it into Mobile Bay, as opposed to when we had all these marshes and lower number of people that were dumping nitrogen into our system. So as a result, this erosion of the marsh leads to substantial loss of capacity for the marsh to remove nitrogen. So, our little coastline, as little as it is and as significant it is to us, we sit next to Louisiana, massive marshes in Louisiana. But they've lost over 1,000 kilometers square from 1985 to 2010. Because I mentioned, Louisiana not only deals with sea level rise, but with subsidence. The land is sinking and sea level is rising, and it drowns the marsh, right? So what we would estimate is that that loss would amount to as much as close to 7,500 tons of nitrogen that have been capacity for removing nitrogen per year as a result of that much loss. That's applying our numbers from one location, generalizing it to a big picture. But imagine how many wastewater treatment plants you need to remove that much nitrogen a year. Quite a few, right? So, and in terms of, and people have tried to think of marshes and their importance, if you deal with economists, right, you need numbers, right? So what is this marsh worth, right? So they look at, what it costs to build and maintain a wastewater treatment plant, and look at the capacity of a marsh to remove nitrogen, and put numbers, what a wastewater treatment removes for a year, for this amount of dollars, to cost to build, to operate, to maintain for 20 years, well, the marsh, nitrogen removal, which is one of the metrics of interest for ecologists or biologists or biogeochemists, is worth that much, $14,000, $15,000 per hectare of marsh per year, right? So then, if that's why, if you destroy a marsh, you got to build an equivalent amount of marsh somewhere else, because there's this much associated with that loss of marsh that we might have caused by construction. And looking throughout the literature, obviously in Louisiana, they're very interested in this capacity of marshes for removing nitrogen. When they've looked at it, our value is about 4 times difference. They get a value of 6 times when they look at the whole of the Louisiana coast and the vegetation when it's, when they measure nitrogen cycling, where the good twin, what it's doing when the marsh is there, as opposed to when the marsh is eroded and you have unvegetated subtidal sediments. And they're interested in this because they have to come up with, corrective measures in terms of reestablishing the levees and, removing levees, so they're trying to put all of that in context. And they estimate that the nitrogen removal capacity for marshes, if in the current scenario, it's worth about 200, it's removing right now at a rate of close to 200,000 tons per year in Louisiana marshes, as opposed to these unvegetated sediments that are right there. When the marsh is eroded away, it's removing only 30. So these are some, to highlight some of the importance of marshes and how they're valuable in terms of what they do in nitrogen cycle alone. Of course, marshes are, have whole other values. There's a lot of fish that use these. When the marsh is flooded, they use it as habitat. There's a lot of crabs that use the marsh, and it's, waterfowl and so forth. So they have other values, besides just this nitrogen removal capacity. But, being a nitrogen person, that's how I value the marsh. So this is a picture of Dauphin Island after Nate, so a few weeks ago, right, 6 weeks ago or whenever it was, right? So the west side of Dauphin Island was flooded, and surge brought sediments onto the road, and that's a house at the end of Dauphin Island that's barely hanging on, that won't take much before it's going to be into the ocean. So you can sit on the balcony on that house and start fishing from the balcony, right? That's how it is. And you can see, this is, the road is totally covered by quite a few feet of sand that the Army Corps is there to remove it, and to create the road again, and then, all of these sand is going to get distributed. But this is kind of what I'm talking about when there's, Nate was tiny, right, in comparison to big storms. But imagine all of that sand now being deposited back on marshes. If marshes were there, that's what it would keep the marsh alive. And when we look at this nitrogen removal capacity, so the good twin, right? When we have looked at it on Dauphin Island, when there are marshes, when we go, in restored marshes, even in creeks, but when we go next to these urbanized places now, where the marsh has disappeared, we can hardly actually measure. You can't see really this figure quite well, but we can hardly measure those rates. They're impossible. They're so low, it's really hard for us to detect. But the interesting side is that the evil twin now is there, right? So this, now somehow the marsh has disappeared, it's lost its capacity, the system has lost its capacity to remove nitrogen, but it's also promoting the retention of nitrogen through the evil twin side of things. So if you think about, what happens is, now imagine all of our coastline. These marshes are disappearing, and I showed you pictures from 1996 to recent, and it's apparent that during that time period, how that marsh has shrunk. And it's happening all over Mobile Bay, in many of our coastline. So they're not there to remove nitrogen, right? So what happens? Well, that nitrogen now is going to flow into our waters. And we worked at Weeks Bay, which is a sub-estuary of Mobile Bay, for quite a few years, and tried to understand, well, if too much nitrogen comes into this system, what is the impact on the ecosystem? And we measured the good twin and the bad twin. So we looked at rates of denitrification, looked at rates of dissimilatory nitrate reduction to ammonium. So that takes nitrate and forms it into ammonium, which is actually the preferred form of nitrogen by algae. So when we looked at these processes, we can see that there's hardly any denitrification going on in Weeks Bay, and there's quite a bit of this other mechanism that retains nitrogen in the system. And we can see, if you look at the chlorophyll, whether it's in the sediments or the water column, they peak at values that are, it's pea soup at that point. 100 micrograms of chlorophyll per liter is like green water, right? There's so much nutrients in this system, and this mechanism has, in essence, lost its capacity to remove the nitrogen, and instead it's retaining the nitrogen, and we have some ideas about why that is. I don't have time to get into it. But now this nitrogen stays in the system, and it goes from, inorganic form to organic form, sediments out, and then it goes back into inorganic form and taken up by algae, and just kind of gets retained in this system, and ultimately can promote these harmful algae. We've done this at multiple places along the coastline, and here again I'm showing you figures in terms of, up in the top table is the good process, removal of nitrogen through denitrification, and in the bottom figure we have this evil twin, the dissimilatory nitrate reduction to ammonium, and those rates are not comparable. They're orders of magnitude different at times. So it's not only in Weeks Bay, so this was in Little Lagoon, which is off Gulf Shores. Even when we go there, these systems that are getting a lot of nutrients coming in, they've kind of now lost the capacity to remove. They're doing as much as they can to promote the removal of nitrogen, but this other process is competing and allowing this nitrogen to stay in the system and to feed this cycle of algae in the water column sedimenting out, being remineralized and retained in the system, and just going back and forth in a cycle. So if we look at, like, for example, average rates of these processes, you can see that the mechanism that retains nitrogen exceed the other process that removes nitrogen through denitrification by an order of magnitude. And so now, instead of trying to go towards nitrogen and losing nitrogen as a gas disappearing from the system, this nitrate, if there is any available, it will go back to ammonium and stays in the system. And so from a geochemistry point of view, for us, is really interesting to understand, why this is happening. And, there's, besides the microbial ecology of it, the geochemistry and the sedimentary processes are really interesting to us and keep us busy. So, kind of, to bring this to an end is, marshes are eroding away, and we have some mechanism that explains the disappearance of marshes. We know how they survive as these periodic input of sediments, but they're super stressed out. So when we get things like oil spills, it erodes a marsh away. Our groundwaters are contaminated because we're doing a lot of sod farming, and in many other locations it's too much agriculture that either releases nitrogen into the streams and watersheds that eventually end up at the coast, or groundwater is contaminated and groundwater brings these nutrients in. And what has happened is that we've promoted, a system now where instead of, having, in the aerobic side where we have these transformations going back and forth, in the anaerobic side where we had denitrification, removing nitrogen, now we have a lot more this other process that retains nitrogen in the system. And if it's retained in our shallow system, it's just going to flow downstream into our open ocean and probably start impacting our near shore coastal ecosystem. So one thing we're interested in now looking and are thinking about is, we've done a lot of work right at the coast, and it's time for us to start looking a little bit further offshore. So here's, transects that my colleagues do in Mobile Bay. They go offshore. This is a picture of actually dissolved oxygen, and you can see that, there's, variability in these parameters that can affect the nitrogen cycle. We know how they would be affected. We're thinking about, we didn't manage to retain this nitrogen right at the coast. No marshes. The mechanism for removal has been weakened. Now it's ending up further offshore, and it would be interesting for us, that's the next step for us to try to understand, ultimately, what is the fate of that nitrogen that is no longer being retained in our nearshore systems. So we're, in our continuing work, we're also looking at these marshes that are, super susceptible right at the coastline, right? We know they are just sinking, and we're wondering, how quickly or how good they are at responding to excess nutrient input that flows into the ocean. So we're simulating some eutrophication of these systems by doing additions of nitrogen and looking at the balance between denitrification, DNRA, the evil and good twin. And we're looking at that when we give them excess nitrogen in these systems, trying to simulate that excess groundwater flow with nitrogen. What would happen if marshes were exposed to it, and trying to understand that. So I'd like to end this by saying, well, how much of a mystery is it? To Fox News, every year it's a mystery, right? But really not to us. When we think about this element that is a limiting nutrient in the ocean, when we have modified the filters that were able to remove it, and processes that have been now promoted geochemically and microbially that retain that nitrogen in the system, it leads to these harmful algal blooms. It's just too much fertilizers, lots of weeds. Those are what they are, and they have these negative impacts in terms of what they do to the ecosystem. The one that we can see easily is periodic fish kills that happen along the Alabama coastline, and that's a story that's applicable to all of our coastlines. So with that, I thank you and take any questions you may have.
Questions?
Are there any efforts right now to replace any of these marshes, or I guess to rebuild?
Yeah, so there's a lot of restoration projects that get initiated, and ultimately, unfortunately, what happens is that they tend to fund one PhD student at most, right? So it's hard to follow up on. But looking at our Alabama coastline, a lot of restoration efforts have failed because there's not enough sediments around to help these marshes build up. So if they don't get built up at the right level with respect to sea level, they get inundated and they just die off. Right? So the success of building marshes is a whole business that a lot of people are interested in, but the evidence for it, at least from what I have seen along our coastline, has shown limited success because there's just the coast is starved by sediments.
Kind of leads me to my question. How important do you think is sediment that comes from rivers or directly from runoff?
Well, that's whether, no matter where they come from, the sediments are the mechanism that allow these marshes to build up, right? But, it's hard to quantify, at least, from what I know, quantify, the source of, exactly where that sediment came from. All we know is that, we need to have some sediment for the marsh to build up. But tracing the source of that, that sediment is pretty challenging. But, it's the periodic input of sediments, and the sediments, they don't get delivered from the river and just stay at one location. They're constantly redistributed, right? So I don't have a good answer for that.
Anything else?
Do you do some mathematical or computational simulation for the whole process?
So, trying to stay in here and just understanding this like occupies all of my time and efforts. But you know, that's the mathematical, the modeling side of this is not something that, you know, we do in my lab. And you know, it would be interesting to try to scale all of these measurements up, you know, but that's not something that, you know, we have tried to do.
All right. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.